President Biden's popularity continues to fall as his domestic agenda stalls in Congress. New CBS News polling shows just half of Americans approve of the job he's doing. That is down 8 points since July. Other polls have his approval as low as 38%. Democrats have been stuck in a stalemate over the size and scope of the president's social and climate spending bill. Moderate senators are looking to cut social and climate programs from the plan. Our CBS News polling paints a troubling picture of the public's understanding of the bill. Our data found more know about the multi-trillion-dollar price tag than what is actually in the president's plan. Nearly 30% of respondents said they do not know a lot of the specific policy proposals. That includes programs like free universal pre-K and paid family leave. Only 10% described themselves as knowing a lot of the details. With a debt limit looming in 2022 just around the corner, Democrats do not have much time to deliver on the president's promises. For more, let's bring in Nikole Killion, Nancy Cordes, Chris Cadelago, and Theo Meyer. Nikole is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Nancy is CBS News chief White House correspondent. Chris is a White House correspondent for Politico. And Theo is the co-author of the Washington Post newsletter, The Early 202. Welcome. A lot to get to on this Monday. Nikole, let me start with you. What can Democrats potentially deliver on before the end of the year?
Well, they hope that it's everything, but obviously that remains to be seen. I mean, obviously, the two big priority items for them are this Build Back Better package, this large social spending package that they have been working on for weeks, if not months now, and also the two-pronged bill that accompanies it, which is a smaller bipartisan infrastructure bill. Those were key priorities that represent what President Biden campaigned on, and as we saw just a month ago, they weren't able to get that bipartisan infrastructure bill done because they were still haggling over that larger social spending package that a lot of people have been, as our polling shows, maybe they're aware of the price tag, but not as so much aware of what's in it. But, you know, that social spending package covers everything from child care to climate and clean energy provisions, lowering drug prices, really a lot of issues that are priorities for Democrats. So that's why it's so critical for them to get it done. But, you know, they're working to try to trim back that price tag a little bit so that they can get more buy-in from everyone within their party. So that's really their main priority. I think until they can get those two things done, you know, everything else pretty much is a secondary issue, but there are certainly other items that are key parts of the president's agenda and Democrats' agenda, whether that's voting rights, whether that's ensuring abortion access, even gun control, which we haven't been talking about as much. So, there's a lot on the list that they would like to tick off, but right now they kind of have to handle those big ticket items. And then on top of it, you've got just the basics, the fundamentals of keeping the government funded and making sure that there's not a default on our debt at the end of the year, now that there are some new deadlines that have been put in place on that. So they have their work cut out for them. But, obviously this really could be a very, I know we say make or break all the time, in our business and as we cover politics, but really you can't understate that this really could be a make or break moment for President Biden's agenda, because obviously if they can't get all of these things done by the end of the year, then it makes it that much tougher as we enter an election year next year.
Yeah, and Chris, to follow up on what Nikole is saying there, it's interesting because while many of the president's policies are broadly popular, the president's approval rating is trending downward with a particularly sharp drop among independents. So how do Democrats understand those numbers? Are they chalking this up to, bad messaging? What is it that you're hearing?
Well, if you go back several months to the beginning of the administration, you had the Biden White House and Democrats really clearing a lot of the low-hanging fruit. There were a number of executive orders that they issued. They passed the American Rescue Plan, and then they sort of ran into trouble in terms of getting things done in the minds of voters. And we've had several months now where you layer on top of that the chaotic and deadly pull out of Afghanistan. We saw his poll numbers dropping after that. We had the crisis at the border and the treatment of Haitian migrants that came up in the last couple months. And so all of those things have contributed to how voters and Americans have viewed this president and viewed whether he's getting the job done. And then just in the last couple months, you've really had the storyline in Washington, which I know Ann touched on, which is this sort of warring within the Democratic Party, fighting on Capitol Hill, the decision on the part of a few senators to make this a time to sort of display their ideological bona fides. And I think, meanwhile, they have a bill sitting there, which is the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which technically they could have passed and given the president a win. And so part of our reporting looks at all of those reasons for his decline. But really the biggest factor in all of this was the resurgence of Delta and the fact that people don't feel like their lives have really gone back to normal. And they've had all these sort of complicated back and forth mixed messages about the virus. We're now seeing major implications on the economy and effects on their lives. Focus grouping we reviewed looked at folks who couldn't buy a car, for example, or want to go out to eat and are not able to do that. So that's just been a consistent drag. And until he can really solve the COVID issue, bring that under control, even with these two bills passing, which would provide him a jolt, most people think, COVID is really the thing that he has to get done, and one of the main things he ran on.
So, Nancy, with what Chris just said in mind, two things. One, what is the White House actually saying about President Biden's dipping approval ratings? And then two, what does it appear White House officials are doing to try and address that?
Well, they try to say as little about his diminishing approval ratings as possible. You know, if you don't acknowledge it, maybe it isn't really there. They don't want to draw any attention to it. What are they doing? Well, they've really got a two-pronged assignment here. First of all, they've got to get his big spending package over the finish line. This is the centerpiece of his agenda. He's got a lot of credibility riding on being able to get this over the finish line. And so they know that it's, as Nikole said, make or break over the next month or so to really seal the votes that they need to get the package passed and then declare victory. But then beyond that, one of the most interesting things that we found in our polling is that a lot of Americans, Democrats and Republicans, don't actually even know what is in this big bill, which, is not great for a White House when you're trying to sort of claim that it is this big victory for you when you get it passed. So once they do pass it, if they do pass it, he is really going to need to get out there and stump on behalf of it and try to explain to the American people what it does, because a lot of the underlying policies in the bill are quite popular. If you ask people, what do you think about universal pre-K, for example? What do you think about making childcare less expensive? People love that. But it's clear that there are a lot of voters who don't know that those things are in this bill.
Well, Chris, are Democrats failing to capitalize on things they did pass, like the COVID relief package?
One of the issues with that is, you look at polling, and this is really troubling for the White House. Anywhere from a third of Republicans and a third of independents feel like Republicans voted for that package. And so that's another problem, is not only getting out there and selling it, but claiming it. And I know there was that 1 or 2 days where President Biden went out with the list of Republicans who had gone back to their districts and talked about aspects of the bill despite voting against it. But that was a 1 or 2 day news cycle, a few stories that came up. They're able to kind of drive the message home that these are things that they like. They could point to the popular aspects of it. And so I think, frankly, the ARP, the American Rescue Plan, might be gone for them. I don't know if there's a way for them to come back and reclaim that. But they are able to, once these two bills, if they are to pass, come back and pull out specific popular measures in there and really run on those. And I think people will, right now they're popular. Those will be a way for them to talk about aspects that they delivered on. But right now, as your poll shows, it's very difficult to be out there selling something when you don't know whether aspects of it will pass. This is all under negotiation, particularly the Build Back Better agenda. And I think many different senators have pulled out various programs that they want passed, as well as House members. But we don't know what will ultimately make it in there. So they could talk about, as Joe Biden has done over the last few weeks, He's been to Michigan. He's been to Illinois. He has been talking about aspects of this agenda. But once, if this is to pass, he'll have an easier way to do that by pointing to specific aspects that people will understand versus kind of a buzzword phrase that doesn't really tell people anybody about the plan.
Meantime, Theo, you've been covering the eroding Republican support for the bipartisan infrastructure bill ever since Speaker Pelosi delayed a vote on it. What is Republican support contingent upon?
Yeah, I spoke with Congressman Don Bacon yesterday, a Republican from Nebraska who represents a swing House district that President Biden carried last year. He told me that support had really eroded among House Republicans for the bipartisan infrastructure package, which of course cleared the Senate back over the summer, but still needs to pass the House. Support was never that strong among Republicans. The House Republican leadership was whipping against the bill, even though business groups such as, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable, were very pro-infrastructure bill. So Bacon told me that support had declined to the point where he wouldn't be surprised if only a couple of Republicans ended up voting for it when it eventually does come up for a vote in the House.
Why is that, Theo? I mean, was there a sort of a reason given? Was it the delay and then just more time talking to constituents? What explains that?
Well, there's this issue of linkage. Both, Republicans and Democrats have tried to link this bipartisan bill that, cleared the Senate on with 19 Republican votes to this, much larger social safety net bill that would, establish universal pre-kindergarten and fight climate change and the like. Both Republicans and Democrats have reasons for trying to link these two things together. Progressives because, they want both of these bills to pass, and House Republicans because they want neither of these bills to pass. So even though they are two separate pieces of legislation, to the extent that the public is aware of them at all, I think they have become linked together in people's minds. People see them as, sort of one larger package, which is also how the Biden administration has framed it, but it's not, technically true from a legislative standpoint.
I see. All right, shifting gears, Nancy, lawyers for former President Trump are attempting to block the Select Committee investigating January 6th by asserting executive privilege. Does that seem likely to work?
Well, they lost the first round when the Biden White House decided that it would not allow the former president to exert executive privilege over all of the initial tranche of documents that were sought by the committee. Mr. Trump was not happy about that. He made that known, so he's trying to fight it. And the president and his advisors haven't ruled out the possibility that they might allow him to exert executive privilege over some documents that the committee seeks in the future. But they said, looking at what the committee wanted, they didn't see any reason that these particular documents should remain private. Where he may have more success is convincing some of the members of his current or former inner circle not to cooperate with the committee. We do know that some of those individuals are now cooperating, individuals like Kash Patel or his former chief of staff, Mark Meadows. Steve Bannon, on the other hand, his former top advisor, is not interacting with the committee right now, as far as we know. And so the former president has certainly put out the word that he doesn't want these people to cooperate. And as we've seen in the past, if you just fight long enough, you can really escape numerous news cycles and investigations without ever cooperating. That was a strategy that some of his top advisors used pretty successfully over the past 4 years. So we'll see if they're able to use it successfully this time around. The committee is saying that it has various means to compel people to testify. We'll see how far they're willing to take it.
Yeah, and so that's my question, Nikole. I mean, what power does the committee have to compel people to comply with these subpoenas?
Well, at the end of the day, that's what I asked at least one of the select committee members last week. Will this investigation have any teeth if you can't get cooperation from some of those key witnesses? And so in their view, they do believe that they can get the work done. Chairman Benny Thompson has been pretty explicit in that he will look at the issue of possible criminal referrals if, in fact, some of these witnesses don't comply, whether that is someone like a Steve Bannon or Dan Scavino, again, depending on how things play out. So he's not ruling that out. But to Nancy's point, that is something that just doesn't happen overnight. It does require, getting other members of Congress on board, referring this to the Justice Department. And so that is something that could drag out. That being said, as I said earlier, many on the committee feel, though, that ultimately that will not impede their work, that they can still continue to speak to people. They say they have gotten cooperation from other people, and so through that, they are optimistic that they could potentially produce some type of report as soon as sometime next year.
All right, finally, Theo, former President Donald Trump held a campaign-style rally in Des Moines, Iowa on Saturday in which he continued to call U.S. elections corrupt without evidence, and he seemed to brag about his handling of his 2020 election loss. Let's go ahead and listen to that.
They called it illegitimate. They called it everything in the book. It was fine. When I say it, now here's the difference. Hillary conceded. I never conceded.
So Republican Senator Chuck Grassley appeared on stage with the former president despite calling Mr. Trump extreme and irresponsible after the Capitol riot. On Saturday, Senator Grassley accepted his endorsement, saying, quote, "If I didn't accept the endorsement of a person that's got 91% of the Republican voters in Iowa, I wouldn't be too smart." Explain for us the position that a potential 2024 Trump candidacy now puts Republicans in.
Well, I think when it comes to Chuck Grassley, it's important to remember that in the vaunted Iowa poll that came out last week, Donald Trump was more popular than Chuck Grassley, despite the fact that Chuck Grassley, is an Iowa political institution, has been in office for decades, is expected to easily win re-election next year when he seeks another term. So I'm sure that is something that was weighing on Senator Grassley as he did this. Donald Trump, in that Iowa poll, more popular than he has ever been in any previous Iowa poll. So when you're facing numbers like that, I think anybody who wants to potentially run for president in 2024 has to look at those numbers and think, how can I do this when Donald Trump is still so popular? Whether that's Nikki Haley, whether that's Mike Pence, whether that's Ron DeSantis, whether that's anyone else.
Right, clearly a huge factor in any Republican's political calculations right now. Nikole Killion, Nancy Cordes, Chris Cadelago, and Theo Meyer, thank you all very much.